I've never told anyone this before because it sounds too insane, but after reading so many other creepy camping stories, I can't keep this to myself anymore. Last summer, my girlfriend Maya and I decided to go camping near this small, out-of-the-way lake in northern Michigan. It's not on any maps, you kind of have to know someone who's been there to even find it. Maya heard about it from her cousin, who swore it was the perfect spot. No other people, amazing fishing, and great views. Sounded like paradise. The drive there was already sketchy. The GPS cut out about 20 minutes before we even got close, so we relied on this grainy screenshot of Google Maps her cousin sent us. The road was barely a road. It was more like a dirt path with potholes big enough to swallow my crappy Honda Civic. We finally got to this tiny clearing where we could park, grabbed our gear, and hiked the rest of the way in. The trail was weird. It wasn't marked, which we expected, but it felt like it was trying to disappear. One minute it was clear, and the next it was swallowed up by the undergrowth, like the forest was alive and didn't want us there. Maya laughed it off, saying I was being dramatic, but I swear I saw her looking over her shoulder more than once. After about an hour of hiking, we found the lake. It was beautiful, I won't lie, like something out of a painting. Crystal clear water, surrounded by thick pine trees and not a single person in sight. We set up our tent near the edge of the water and started a little fire to cook some hot dogs. It was peaceful for the first couple of hours. But then we noticed something strange. Across the lake, tucked just inside the tree line, was a cabin. At least it looked like a cabin, a dark, boxy shape with a pitched roof. But here's the thing. Maya's cousin swore there were no cabins or campsites anywhere near this lake. That's why people came here. Total isolation. Maybe someone built it after he was here? Maya suggested, squinting at it. Doesn't look new, I said. Roof's sagging, looks abandoned. She shrugged. Let's check it out tomorrow. It's too far to bother with tonight. I agreed, even though something about it made my skin crawl. The longer I stared, the less sure I was that it even was a cabin. It seemed to shift, like it was almost dissolving into the shadows of the trees. I told myself it was just the light playing tricks on me. We tried to ignore it and focus on enjoying the evening, but the vibe was already off. The forest was too quiet. No bugs, no birds, no frogs, just dead silence. The only sound was the occasional ripple from the lake, like something was swimming just under the surface. Maya joked that the fish were too smart to bite, but even she sounded uneasy. We gave up on fishing and turned in early, both of us pretending we weren't creeped out. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was still pitch black. Something had pulled me out of sleep, this faint rhythmic sound like tapping. I held my breath, straining to hear, tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the lake. Maya, I whispered, shaking her shoulder. She groaned and rolled over, clearly annoyed. Do you hear that? I asked. She sat up, listening. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a soft splash. Then another. It sounded like someone was throwing rocks into the water. Probably just fish, she mumbled, lying back down. But it didn't sound like fish. The splashes were too deliberate, too spaced out. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent. Maya muttered something about me being paranoid as I stepped out into the cold night air. The lake was completely still, reflecting the moon like a giant mirror. I swept the flashlight across the water, but there was nothing. No ripples, no movement. Then I aimed the light at the tree line where the cabin had been. It wasn't there. Maya, I hissed, my voice shaking. The cabin's gone. She groaned again and sat up. What are you talking about? I kept the flashlight trained on the spot. I know what I saw earlier. The cabin had been right there, but now it was just trees and shadows. Maybe you imagined it, she said, crawling out of the tent to stand next to me. She grabbed the flashlight from my hand and pointed it across the lake herself. See? Nothing. We stood there for a while, just staring at the empty spot where the cabin had been. I wanted to believe I'd imagined it, but the sinking feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. Eventually, we went back to bed, but I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard faint tapping, like something was knocking on the water. The next morning, we decided to check out the spot where the cabin had been. I was convinced we'd find some kind of foundation or remains, something to prove I wasn't losing my mind. But when we got to the tree line, there was nothing there. No clearing, no trail, no sign a cabin had ever existed. "Let's just go back," Maya said, visibly uncomfortable. But I wasn't ready to leave yet. Not until I figured out what was going on. We spent most of the morning hiking around the lake, searching for any sign of the cabin. I kept telling Maya it had to be there, maybe hidden by the trees or just out of sight. She humored me for a while, but I could tell she was over it. "Look," she said, wiping sweat from her forehead. "You saw something weird last night, I get it. But there's nothing here. Can we please just go back to the campsite?" I didn't respond right away. The spot where the cabin had been, it didn't make sense. The trees were too thick, the underbrush untouched. It wasn't like someone had torn it down. It was like it had never been there in the first place. "Fine," I muttered. "Let's head back." As we walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the cabin again. But it was just trees. The oppressive silence from the night before hadn't gone away. In fact, it felt worse. The forest seemed heavier, darker, like it was pressing in on us. By the time we got back to the campsite, it was almost noon, and the lake looked different somehow. The water wasn't clear anymore. It was murky, with patches of brown and green swirling near the surface. "Was the water like this yesterday?" I asked, kneeling by the edge of the lake. "No," Maya said, frowning. "It was crystal clear. That's why I wanted to camp here in the first place." She crouched down next to me, running her fingers through the water. "It feels warm, that's weird, right?" I didn't answer. Something was floating just a few feet from the shore, a log I thought at first. But then I noticed the shape was too round, too human. "Maya," I said, my voice tight. "Don't move." She froze, following my gaze to the water. The shape drifted closer, and as it did, I felt my stomach twist. It wasn't a log. It was a body, face down, its arms floating limply at its sides. "Oh my God," Maya whispered, scrambling back. "What the hell?" I grabbed a stick and poked at it, pulling it closer to shore. The body was bloated and discolored, like it had been in the water for days. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. The features were too distorted. But what really freaked me out was the clothes. They looked old, like something out of the 70s. "We need to call the cops," Maya said, digging through her backpack for her phone. "No signal," I reminded her. "We'd have to hike back to the car first." She cursed under her breath, her hands shaking as she shoved her phone back into her bag. "What do we do?" she asked. I didn't have an answer. My brain was stuck on the clothes, the fact that this body had clearly been in the lake for a long time, yet the water was clear just yesterday. How had we not seen it before? "We leave," I said finally. "Pack up, get to the car, and report this as soon as we have service." Maya didn't argue. We grabbed our gear and started breaking down the tent as fast as we could. The whole time, I couldn't stop glancing at the lake. The body hadn't moved, but I kept feeling like it was watching us somehow. As we were finishing up, there was a sound, a low, echoing thunk from the middle of the lake. We both froze, staring at the water. "What was that?" Maya asked, her voice trembling. I scanned the lake but didn't see anything. Then I noticed something strange. Ripples. They started near the center of the lake and spread outward, heading straight for us. "Let's go," I said, grabbing her arm. We bolted, leaving the fire pit and a couple of cooking tools behind. The trail back to the car felt longer than it had yesterday, the trees closing in around us. Neither of us spoke. We just kept moving, our breath ragged and our legs burning. About halfway back, Maya stopped suddenly. "Do you hear that?" she asked. I strained my ears and heard it, a faint tapping sound like the noise I'd heard the night before. It was coming from somewhere in the woods, off to our left. "We're not stopping," I said, pulling her forward. But the sound followed us, growing louder and closer with every step. It wasn't just tapping anymore. There were footsteps now, heavy and deliberate, keeping pace with us just out of sight. "Maya, run!" I said, and we took off sprinting. The footsteps chased us, crashing through the underbrush. I didn't dare look back, afraid of what I might see. When we finally burst out of the trees and into the clearing where we'd parked, I almost cried with relief. We threw our bags into the car and I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get the door unlocked. As I started the engine, Maya screamed. "What?" I yelled, slamming the car into reverse. She pointed out the window, back toward the trail. Standing at the edge of the trees was a figure. It was too far away to make out details, but I could tell it was tall, thin, and soaking wet. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I floored it, tearing down the dirt road and leaving the lake, and whatever that thing was, behind. We didn't stop driving until we were back on a paved road miles away from the lake. The whole way, Maya kept twisting in her seat to look out the back window, her face pale and tight with fear. "Do you think it's still following us?" she asked. "I don't know," I said, gripping the wheels so hard my knuckles turned white. "I don't think so, but I'm not slowing down to find out." We were both shaken, barely speaking. I kept replaying the past 24 hours in my head, trying to make sense of it. The cabin that disappeared, the body in the lake, the footsteps in the woods, none of it added up. Eventually, we found a gas station on the side of the highway. I pulled in, more for the safety of being around other people than because we needed gas. Maya stayed in the car while I went inside to use the payphone to call the police. When I told the dispatcher about the body in the lake, she sounded skeptical. "Are you sure it was a human body?" she asked. "Could it have been a deer, maybe? Or a mannequin?" "It wasn't a deer," I snapped. "And it definitely wasn't a mannequin." She sighed. "We'll send someone to check it out. Can you tell me exactly where this lake is?" That's when I realized I couldn't. I gave her a rough description of the area and the directions Maya's cousin had sent us, but it wasn't much to go on. The dispatcher didn't sound hopeful. "We'll do our best," she said before hanging up. When I got back to the car, Maya was staring out the window, her face tense. "What's wrong?" I asked. She didn't answer right away, just pointed at the corner of the parking lot. I followed her gaze and felt my stomach drop. There was a wet footprint on the pavement, just one, like someone had stepped out of the woods and stopped there. "We're leaving," I said, climbing back into the car. We drove straight back to her cousin's house, where Maya tore into him as soon as we walked in the door. "What the hell did you send us to?" she shouted. "That lake isn't perfect. It's a nightmare." Her cousin looked genuinely confused. "What are you talking about? I've been there a dozen times. It's just a quiet spot to fish and camp." "No," I said, shaking my head. "Something's wrong with that place. There's a cabin that shows up and disappears, a body in the water." "Wait, what cabin?" he interrupted. We told him everything, and by the end of it, his face was as pale as ours. "I've never seen a cabin there," he said. "Or a body. Are you sure you went to the right lake?" "Pretty sure," Maya snapped. "Unless there's another random lake an hour into the middle of nowhere with the exact same layout." He fell silent, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, I don't know what to tell you. That's never happened to me, or anyone else I know who's been there." We left shortly after that, too drained to keep arguing. I don't think Maya's cousin was lying, but it didn't make me feel any better. If anything, it made everything worse. The next few days were a blur. We didn't hear back from the police, which wasn't surprising given how vague our directions had been. But I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin and the figure we'd seen at the edge of the woods. Then 2 nights after we got back, I woke up to a sound outside my window. Tap, tap, tap. It was the same rhythmic tapping I'd heard at the lake, only now it was coming from right outside. My heart pounded as I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. Slowly, I crept to the window and pulled back the curtain. There was nothing there. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, and the next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. A single wet footprint on the sidewalk outside my house. I didn't tell Maya about it. She was already on edge, jumping at every little noise and refusing to go outside after dark. She didn't need another reason to be scared. We stopped talking about the lake after that, like pretending it never happened would make it go away. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. A few weeks later, Maya's cousin called me out of the blue. "Hey," he said, his voice shaky. "You're not gonna believe this." "What?" I asked, already dreading the answer. "I went back to the lake," he said. "I wanted to see if you were right, if there really was a cabin or whatever. And, I found something. What did you find? He hesitated. There's a cabin there now, exactly where you said it was. But it's wrong, man. It feels wrong. I didn't ask him to explain. I didn't want to know. Stay away from it, I said. Promise me you won't go near it. He promised, but I didn't believe him, and honestly, I wasn't sure it mattered. Some places don't let you go. It was a late summer evening when I decided to take my son, Ethan, on a camping trip. He had just turned 8 and had been begging for a father-son weekend ever since he saw a survival show on TV. Ethan was an adventurous kid, full of questions and energy, and I thought this would be a great way to bond while giving him a taste of the outdoors. We chose a remote spot deep in Pine Hollow Forest, a place I remembered fondly from my teenage years. It was quiet, secluded, and far from any tourist trails, a perfect retreat from the distractions of everyday life. We packed up the essentials, a tent, sleeping bags, flashlights, and enough snacks to last a week. Ethan even brought along his trusty notebook, claiming he was going to document the wilderness. The drive to the forest was uneventful. Ethan was glued to the car window, marveling at the thick canopy of trees that seemed to swallow the sunlight. By the time we arrived and set up camp, the sky was painted with streaks of orange and pink. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. As we gathered firewood, Ethan paused, staring into the woods. "Dad, did you see that?" he asked, his voice tinged with excitement. "See what, bud?" I followed his gaze but saw nothing beyond the dense trees. "There was someone standing there," he said, pointing toward a shadowy thicket. I chuckled. "Probably just your imagination. These woods can play tricks on your eyes when it gets dark." Ethan frowned but didn't argue. We finished building the fire, and soon the flames cast a warm glow over our small campsite. We roasted marshmallows and shared stories, laughing under the stars. It was perfect. As the night wore on, Ethan grew tired and crawled into the tent. I stayed by the fire, enjoying the solitude and the gentle crackle of the flames. It wasn't until I heard the snap of a twig behind me that my peace was disturbed. I turned, peering into the darkness. "Hello?" I called, half expecting to see a deer or some other animal. But there was nothing, just the stillness of the forest. Shrugging it off, I doused the fire and climbed into the tent, lying beside Ethan. His soft snores were oddly comforting, and I soon drifted off to sleep. I woke up to the sound of whispering. At first, I thought it was Ethan talking in his sleep, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized the whispers were coming from outside the tent. My heart began to race. Carefully, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The fire had burned down to embers, and the moon cast a pale light over the clearing. That's when I saw it. Movement at the edge of the woods. It was faint, like a shadow darting between the trees. I froze, straining my ears to catch any sound, but the whispers had stopped. "Probably just an animal," I muttered to myself, though I didn't fully believe it. Closing the tent, I lay back down, trying to convince myself there was nothing to worry about. But sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, Ethan seemed oblivious to my unease. He was up early, sketching the trees and scribbling notes in his notebook. "This place is amazing, Dad," he said, his face lighting up with excitement. I forced a smile. "Glad you're enjoying it, buddy." We spent the day exploring the forest, hiking along a creek and spotting wildlife. Ethan was in his element, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As the sun began to set, we returned to camp. Ethan proudly showed me his notebook filled with sketches of birds and plants. But one drawing made my stomach tighten. A crude figure standing among the trees, its limbs unnaturally long and its face blank. "Where did you see this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Ethan looked up at me, puzzled. "I didn't see it, I just thought of it. Cool, right?" I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Yeah, cool." That night, as we sat by the fire, Ethan grew quiet. "Dad, do you hear that?" I listened, my ears straining. At first, there was nothing but the crackling fire. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the woods. Ethan scooted closer to me. "What is that?" I don't know, I admitted, standing up. The tapping grew louder, more deliberate, like someone knocking on wood. Grabbing the flashlight, I aimed it toward the sound. The beam illuminated the trees, but there was nothing there. Stay here, I told Ethan, stepping toward the edge of the clearing. The tapping stopped. Hello? I called, my voice echoing through the silent forest. For a moment, there was no response. Then, from deep within the woods, a voice answered. Hello? It was my voice. Okay, so I know what you're thinking. I should have packed up and left the moment I heard my own voice coming from the woods. Trust me, I was thinking the same thing. But when you're out there, in the middle of nowhere with your kid, logic doesn't exactly scream the loudest. Instead, I told myself it was probably some kind of echo or trick of the wind. Yeah, I know. Stupid. Dad. Who was that? Ethan whispered behind me, his voice shaking a little. No one, I said, trying to sound confident. It's just the forest messing with us, nothing to worry about. I wanted to believe that. I really did. We sat by the fire a little longer, and eventually Ethan started to relax. He even went back to doodling in his notebook, though I noticed he was glancing over his shoulder every few seconds. I couldn't blame him. I was doing the same. The weird thing is, nothing else happened that night. No more voices, no more tapping, just the normal sounds of the forest. Eventually, Ethan got tired and went to bed, and I stayed up a little longer, keeping an eye on the tree line. Nothing. By the time I crawled into the tent, I was half convinced I'd imagined the whole thing. But then morning came, and things got weirder. I woke up to Ethan shaking me. Dad, he whispered, his face pale. Come look at this. Still groggy, I followed him out of the tent. The first thing I noticed was that the fire pit was completely cold, like it had been out for hours. The second thing was that Ethan's notebook was lying open on the ground, pages flapping in the breeze. Did you leave that out here? I asked. He shook his head. No, I left it in the tent last night. That's when I saw the drawings. The first few pages were normal, birds, trees, the little creek we hiked to yesterday. But as I flipped through, the sketches started to change. The lines got rougher, shakier. There were figures now, dark, shadowy shapes standing at the edge of the trees. The last page stopped me cold. It was our campsite drawn from above. The tent, the fire pit, even Ethan's little backpack. And there, just beyond the clearing, were dozens of those shadowy figures, all watching us. Did you draw this? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. No, Ethan said, looking genuinely freaked out. I didn't. I swear. I believed him. We decided to pack up and leave. I told Ethan it was because we'd seen enough of the forest and it was time to head home. But the truth was, I had this gnawing feeling in my gut that we weren't alone out there. Of course, the forest had other plans. As we were hiking back to the car, the air started to feel wrong. The birds went silent first, then the insects. The whole forest was dead quiet, except for the sound of our footsteps crunching on the dirt trail. Ethan was holding my hand now, his grip tight. Dad, do you hear that? He whispered. At first, I didn't hear anything, but then it started. A low hum, almost like a distant engine. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. We need to keep moving, I said, trying to stay calm. The hum got louder, and then we saw it. At first I thought it was just a tree, but as we got closer I realized it wasn't. It was something else. A tall black figure, thin as a telephone pole, with limbs that stretched unnaturally long. Its head, or what I assumed was its head, was tilted to the side like it was watching us. Ethan gasped and the thing twitched. It didn't move toward us. It just shifted slightly, like it was deciding what to do next. Don't run, I whispered, gripping Ethan's hand so hard I was afraid I'd hurt him. Just keep walking. We started moving again, slowly, not taking our eyes off the thing. It stayed where it was, but I swear it was following us with its gaze. The hum grew louder, almost deafening now. My head was pounding and I felt like I was going to be sick, but I couldn't stop. Couldn't let Ethan stop. Finally, we reached the car. I shoved Ethan inside and slammed the door shut, fumbling with the keys. The whole time I kept glancing back at the tree line, expecting to see that thing standing there. but it wasn't. The hum stopped as soon as the engine roared to life. I didn't waste any time. I threw the car into gear and got us the hell out of there. As we drove, Ethan was quiet. Too quiet. "You okay, buddy?" I asked, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. He didn't look up from his notebook. "I don't think it wanted us to leave," he said softly. My stomach turned. "What do you mean?" He held up the notebook. On the last page was a new drawing, one he definitely hadn't made. It was our car, driving down the forest road. And in the back seat, next to Ethan, was a dark, shadowy figure. I slammed on the brakes so hard the car skidded to a stop in the middle of the empty road. My heart was pounding, my hands gripping the steering wheel like a lifeline. "Ethan," I said, my voice barely steady, "hand me that notebook, right now." He didn't argue. His little hands trembled as he passed it to me, and I flipped to the last page, praying I'd imagined it. I hadn't. The drawing was exactly how he'd shown me. The car, the winding road, and a shadowy figure sitting right there next to my son. I whipped around in my seat, shining the flashlight into the back. Nothing. Just Ethan, his wide, scared eyes staring back at me. "Dad, what's going on?" he whispered. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to explain the impossible. "It's fine," I lied, forcing a smile. "Probably just some smudges on the paper. Don't worry about it." Ethan didn't look convinced, but he didn't press me. I put the car back in drive and floored it, desperate to get as far away from that forest as possible. The road out of Pine Hollow felt longer than I remembered. Trees pressed in on both sides, their gnarled branches twisting overhead like skeletal fingers. The further we went, the darker it seemed to get, even though it was only late afternoon. Ethan stared out the window, his notebook clutched tightly in his lap. "Dad," he said after a while, "do you think it's still following us?" I didn't want to answer that. "I don't know," I admitted, "but we're almost out of here. Just stay calm, okay?" He nodded, but I could see the fear in his eyes. That's when I noticed the trees. At first I thought it was just the shadows playing tricks on me, but as we rounded a bend I realized they weren't trees at all. They were figures, tall, thin, and black as tar, lining the road on either side. "Ethan, don't look," I said, my voice tight. Of course he looked. "Dad," his voice cracked, "there's more of them." "I know," I said, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles went white. "Just keep your eyes on me, okay? Don't look at them." He nodded again, tears streaming silently down his face. I pressed the gas harder, the car roaring as we sped down the road. The figures didn't move, they just stood there watching. But the further we went, the closer they seemed to get to the road, until it felt like we were driving through a tunnel of shadows. And then the car died. No warning, no sputtering, just silence. The headlights flickered out, leaving us in complete darkness. "Stay in the car," I told Ethan, my voice shaking. "Don't leave," he cried, grabbing my arm. "I'm not going far," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I just need to check the engine. It'll be fine." He didn't let go at first, but eventually he nodded. I stepped out, flashlight in hand, and popped the hood. Everything looked fine. No smoke, no leaks, nothing out of place. But when I tried to start the car again, it was dead. That's when I heard it. The hum. It was louder now, vibrating through the air like a swarm of angry bees. I shone the flashlight into the trees, and that's when I saw them. The figures were moving now, slowly closing in on the car. "Ethan!" I shouted, slamming the hood shut. "Lock the doors!" I jumped back into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind me. Ethan was curled up in the back, crying. "They're coming," he whispered. "I know," I said, turning the key again. "Come on, come on!" The car roared to life. Without wasting a second, I floored it, the tires screeching as we tore down the road. The figures didn't chase us, they just stood there watching as we drove away. But the hum didn't stop. It followed us all the way out of the forest, fading only when we reached the main highway. Neither of us spoke the rest of the way home. When we finally got back, I parked the car in the driveway and sat there for a moment, trying to process everything. Ethan climbed out without a word and went straight inside. I followed him, locking every door and window behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those figures, those tall, twisted shadows. Around 3 a.m., I gave up and went to check on Ethan. He was asleep, clutching his notebook like a teddy bear. I carefully took it from him, intending to put it away so he wouldn't scare himself with it in the morning. But when I opened it, my blood ran cold. The last page wasn't a drawing this time. It was a message scrawled in shaky, childlike handwriting. "You can't leave. We're always with you." I dropped the notebook and stumbled back, my heart racing. And then I heard it. The hum. So yeah, I'm not exactly the outdoorsy type. My idea of roughing it is forgetting to charge my phone before bed. But when my buddy Jake called me up with this brilliant idea to camp at Black Hollow, I figured, why not? Jake's always been the adventurous one, and I didn't want to be the guy who bailed. He said it was supposed to be the ultimate disconnect from reality trip. No phones, no Wi-Fi, just us, the woods, and a cooler full of beers. Now, if you've never heard of Black Hollow, here's the rundown. It's this old overgrown state park that's technically closed to the public, but no one enforces it. It's got trails that lead to nowhere, a dried-up riverbed, and a bunch of legends about people vanishing back in the day. You know, super inviting stuff. Anyway, Jake picks me up in his beat-up truck, blasting some terrible 2000s alt-rock, and we're off. The drive out there was mostly uneventful, just miles of empty roads and trees. The kind of place where your GPS gives up halfway and you have to rely on the one guy who swears he knows the way. Spoiler, Jake didn't. We finally get to Black Hollow around sunset, and I'm not gonna lie, the place was creepy. The trees were tall and packed tight, their branches twisting like skeleton fingers. The air felt still, like the forest was holding its breath. "Dude, this is perfect," Jake said, hopping out of the truck like he'd just found the Garden of Eden. I followed him, dragging my feet and muttering about mosquitoes. "Sure, perfect if you want to get murdered in the middle of nowhere," I shot back. Jake just laughed. "Oh, come on, don't tell me you believe all that crap about this place." "Believe it? No. But I'm also not stupid enough to ignore it," I said, glancing over my shoulder. The stories were classic campfire horror. Hikers vanishing without a trace, weird noises at night, a mysterious figure lurking in the woods. Stuff you'd laugh off until you're actually there, in the middle of it with the sun going down. We set up camp near the old riverbed. The ground was uneven and the trees overhead made it feel like we were being watched. Jake lit a fire, and for a while it was fine. We were drinking, laughing, and swapping dumb stories from high school. I started to relax, figuring my paranoia was just that, paranoia. Then, sometime after midnight, the woods went dead silent. Like, no crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing. Even the fire seemed quieter, its crackle muted. "You hear that?" I asked, sitting up. Jake looked up from his beer, raising an eyebrow. "Hear what?" "Exactly," I said. "It's too quiet." Jake rolled his eyes. "You've been watching too many horror movies, man. Chill out." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I didn't say anything else, though. I didn't want Jake to think I was losing it. We eventually crawled into our sleeping bags, the fire dying down to embers. I was exhausted, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something, a faint crunch of leaves, a twig snapping. "Jake, you awake?" I whispered. No answer. I don't know when I finally drifted off, but when I woke up, it was pitch black, and I swear I wasn't alone. "Jake?" I whispered. No response. I reached for my flashlight, fumbling with the switch, but before I could turn it on, I heard it. A low, guttural sound, almost like breathing, but wrong. It wasn't Jake. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to stay quiet. The sound came closer, slow and deliberate, like whatever it was knew I was there. My hand hovered over the flashlight, debating whether I should turn it on or not. Then, just outside the tent, something scratched against the fabric. I don't know how long I stayed frozen like that, my hand hovering over the flashlight, my breath caught in my throat. The scratching sound wasn't constant. It came in bursts, like whatever was outside was testing the material of the tent. "Jake," I whispered again, a little louder this time. Still no answer. His tent was just a few feet from mine, but it might as well have been miles. The scratching stopped. For a second, I thought maybe I imagined it. My hand was shaking as I finally flicked on the flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating the inside of my tent and nothing else. Just my sleeping bag, my backpack, and the crumpled wrapper from a granola bar. I exhaled shakily and leaned closer to the tent door, trying to listen for anything outside. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Not the steady crunch of someone walking, but a weird, uneven shuffle, like whoever, or whatever it was, had no idea how to use their legs. And it was circling the campsite. Every hair on my body stood on end. I wanted to call out for Jake again, but something told me that was a bad idea. Instead, I slowly unzipped my tent, just enough to peek outside. The fire had completely died, leaving only faint embers glowing in the pit. The moonlight wasn't much help, but I could just make out the outline of Jake's tent. It was zipped shut, no movement. But beyond that, deeper in the shadows of the trees, something was there. I couldn't see it clearly, but the shape was all wrong. Too tall, too thin, with arms that seemed to hang too low. It wasn't moving now, just standing there at the edge of the clearing, watching. I don't know how long I stared at it, but suddenly it took a step forward. I ducked back into my tent and killed the flashlight, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I didn't know what to do. Running into the woods seemed suicidal, but staying put didn't feel much better. Then I heard it again. That scratch, scratch, scratch right outside my tent. I held my breath, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The scratching turned into a low, groaning sound like wood bending under pressure. "Jake!" I hissed, finally breaking. This time there was a response, but it didn't come from Jake. It came from outside. "Help me!" a voice rasped, barely louder than a whisper. It sounded human, almost. But there was something off about it, like someone trying to mimic a voice they'd never used before. "Jake!" I called out again, my voice cracking. "Help me!" the voice repeated, closer now. I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tent and bolted, not even bothering to grab my shoes. The cold dirt and sharp twigs bit into my feet as I sprinted toward Jake's tent. "Jake, wake up!" I yelled, shaking the tent. No response. Panic set in as I unzipped his tent and shined the flashlight inside. It was empty. No Jake, no sleeping bag, just an overturned cooler and his jacket tossed in the corner. "What the hell?" I muttered, spinning around. That's when I realized the footsteps were back. They weren't shuffling anymore, they were running, and they weren't coming from the woods. They were coming from my tent. I didn't wait to see what came out of my tent. I bolted, sprinting toward the truck like my life depended on it. Because it did. My feet were raw, every step sending sharp pains shooting up my legs. But I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there. The truck was parked about 50 yards from the campsite, half hidden in the brush. The problem? Jake had the keys. I skidded to a stop when I reached it, frantically patting my pockets even though I knew they were empty. "Jake, you son of a..." I started, but the words died in my throat when I saw it. There, in the faint glow of the moonlight, was Jake's jacket. It was draped over the hood of the truck like someone had laid it there on purpose. "Jake?" I called, my voice shaking. No answer. I edged closer, every instinct telling me to turn back, but I couldn't help it. Something about the way the jacket was just there felt deliberate, like it wanted me to find it. When I got close enough, I saw something sticking out of the pocket. A folded piece of paper. My hands were trembling as I pulled it out and unfolded it. Scrawled in black marker in Jake's messy handwriting were the words, "It wants you to stay." I barely had time to process what that meant when I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were right behind me. I whipped around, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. "Jake!" I yelled, my voice echoing through the forest. The response came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. A guttural, inhuman growl that made my knees nearly buckle. It was low and deep, vibrating in my chest like the forest itself was alive. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root and hitting the ground hard. The flashlight flew out of my hand, landing a few feet away. The beam flickered, casting jagged shadows across the trees. That's when I saw it. The thing from earlier, the tall, thin figure, was standing just at the edge of the light, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and wrong, like a puppet with tangled strings. And its face. or lack of one. There was nothing there, just a blank, smooth surface where a face should have been. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I just sat there, staring, as it slowly lifted one impossibly long arm and pointed at me. Something snapped inside me. Maybe it was survival instinct, or maybe I just lost it completely, but I scrambled to my feet and ran. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to put as much distance between me and that thing as possible. The forest was a blur of shadows and trees, branches clawing at my skin as I crashed through the underbrush. The footsteps followed, but they weren't shuffling or running anymore. They were everywhere, surrounding me, closing in. I tripped again, landing hard on my side, and for a second I thought that was it. But then I saw it. Light. A faint, flickering glow in the distance. A cabin. I didn't think. I just ran for it, throwing myself against the door and pounding like a madman. "Help! Please, somebody!" The door creaked open and I nearly collapsed inside. An old man stood there, his face weathered and tired, holding a shotgun. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and grim. There's something out there," I stammered, barely able to form words. It's after me." He nodded like he already knew. "You've seen it, haven't you?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. He stepped aside, motioning for me to sit. I sank into a chair by the fire, trembling, as he locked the door and pulled the curtains tight. "Black Hollow doesn't like visitors," he said, setting the shotgun on the table. "But if you're lucky, it might let you leave. Might." "Jake," I croaked. "My friend, he's still out there." The old man's expression darkened. "If it took him, there's no getting him back." I felt my stomach drop. "What do you mean? What is it?" He didn't answer right away, just stared into the fire. Finally, he said, "It doesn't have a name. Doesn't need one. It's been here longer than we have, and it doesn't like to share." I wanted to argue, to scream at him to do something, but before I could, there was a knock at the door. Not a frantic knock like mine had been, but slow, steady. Knock, knock, knock. The old man's face went pale. "Don't move. Don't speak. And whatever you do, don't open that door." I froze in the chair. Every muscle in my body tensed as the knocks continued. Slow, deliberate, almost mocking. Knock, knock, knock. The old man grabbed his shotgun and stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on the door. "It's testing us," he whispered. "Stay quiet, and it might go away." Might. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper. The room felt stifling, like all the air had been sucked out. My gaze darted around looking for something, anything that could help. But the cabin was bare, just the fire, a small table, and a few chairs. Knock, knock, knock. "How does it know we're here?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The old man didn't look at me. "It always knows." The knock stopped. For a second, I thought maybe it had left. But then came the scratching. That same awful sound I'd heard outside my tent. Slow, deliberate strokes against the wood like it was carving its way inside. "Why doesn't it just break in?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The old man finally looked at me, his eyes dark and hollow. "Because it doesn't have to. It'll wait until we let it in." My stomach twisted. Why would anyone let it in? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside. His face went even paler, and he let the fabric fall. "What is it?" I asked, panic creeping into my voice. He didn't respond, just motioned for me to stay quiet, but I couldn't help myself. I got up and crossed the room, heart pounding as I leaned toward the window. What I saw made my blood run cold. Jake was standing outside. He was facing the cabin, his shoulders slumped, his arms hanging limp at his sides. His face was pale, his eyes wide and glassy like he wasn't really seeing anything. I stumbled back, my mind racing. "Jake!" I shouted before I could stop myself. The old man spun around, furious. "You idiot! It's not your friend anymore." The scratching at the door stopped, and for a moment everything went silent. Then Jake's voice came, muffled but unmistakable. "Hey man, let me in. It's freezing out here." I stared at the old man, desperate. What if it's really him? We can't just leave him out there. The old man's expression didn't change. It's not him. How do you know? Because that's what it does. It takes what you care about and uses it against you. If you open that door, we're both dead. Jake's voice came again, softer this time. Come on, dude. It's me. Don't you trust me? I felt a lump in my throat. It sounded exactly like him, down to the way he said dude, the slight crack in his voice when he was scared. Don't listen, the old man hissed. But I couldn't help it. My hand was already moving toward the lock. Don't, he barked, grabbing my arm. Jake's voice turned desperate. Please, man. It's so cold out here. I'm scared. I wrenched my arm away, my mind a whirlwind of doubt. If it's him and we do nothing, he'll die out there. The old man stepped in front of the door, blocking me. Better him than both of us. Before I could respond, there was a loud thud against the door, then another. Thud, thud. Whatever was out there was done playing games. The old man raised his shotgun, his knuckles white. Get in the corner and stay there. Don't move until I say. I obeyed, scrambling to the far side of the room as the door shook violently. Thud, thud. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the pounding stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. I wanted to ask if it was over, but I was too scared to speak. The old man stood there, his gun trained on the door, his breathing ragged. It's not done, he muttered. It's never done. And then came the final blow. The door didn't burst open like I expected. Instead, it caved inward, bending at an impossible angle like it was being sucked into a black hole. The thing stepped inside. It wasn't Jake, not anymore. Its body was twisted and broken, its limbs bending in ways that defied logic. Its face, or what was left of it, was a blank canvas, pale and featureless. The old man fired, the shotgun blast echoing in the tiny cabin, but it didn't even flinch. It turned its blank face toward me, and I felt something cold and heavy settle over me, like gravity itself had doubled. The old man screamed something, but his voice was drowned out by a deafening roar, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then it was right in front of me. I don't remember much after that. When I woke up, I was alone in the woods. The cabin was gone. Jake was gone. I stumbled my way back to the truck, somehow finding the keys on the hood where the jacket had been. I don't know how I made it out of Black Hollow, but I've never gone back. Sometimes, though, I hear it in my dreams, the slow, deliberate knock, and every time I wake up wondering if I'll hear it outside my door next.